is this grimdark, or is this grimdark, or is this grimdark? I don't know. Well, I have some thoughts. I'm not an expert on what people call the grimdark subgenre of, I guess, particularly fantasy nowadays. Those are books I've read, and I've read the rest of the Song of Ice and Fire and most associated things. I haven't read loads of other Abercrombie or Lynch, but it's something I think about when I think about what people say they like and what's popular in fantasy. An early video I did on this channel was about whether or not Game of Thrones is actually full of twists, and this is kind of relevant as well, because I think what I saw there was people said, "Oh, I never know what's going to happen," and I thought, I think most people probably know what's going to happen in Song of Ice and Fire from book to book. And there's a similar question here, a similar issue that comes up for me, is when people say, "Oh, I love this grimdark stuff," is, do they actually? What is it that they're reading, and what do they enjoy? I say this as a non-expert. Partly, I'm here asking questions, not trying to fully answer them. Here's the thing: this is what grimdark is. In the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. It's a Warhammer 40,000 slogan. Everything is terrible in Warhammer 40,000 as per that representation of the setting. You know, everyone's dying all the time. You know, you're even in the Imperium, which might be the best place in the galaxy to be. You drudge away, and then your planet gets purged, and all your children die or something, or you get ripped apart by a demon. If you're elves, you're constantly worrying about your soul being sucked up and eaten by Slaanesh. You know, I guess the orcs have a good time, but the whole point is they're a kind of completely animalistic and destructive species. And there's different takes on the 40k setting, to be clear. Like, they're not all grimdark, but the very fact that that's the presentation, you know, there's only war, there's only death and annihilation and corruption and tragedy. And I guess that's a useful marker of something that we might say, oh, grimdark is like that. Grimdark is just depressing. And it's useful to try to parse it and try to think, like, can I come up with one sentence that describes what grimdark is? Because if it's just bad things happen to good characters, then Good Wives by Louisa May Alcott, that's very grimdark, you know. And we could probably find other cases of the same. I mean, Marianne Dashwood has a hard time at one point in Sense and Sensibility. I guess that was a really grimdark section. Of course, we know those things aren't grimdark books. We know that family saga novels aren't grimdark. We know that grimdark refers in, particularly ironically, fantasy, but also obviously sci-fi, to this sense that everything's very gloomy and nasty. And I guess that could mean a few things. It could mean that it is not a moral universe. It could mean people are morally ambiguous. It could mean what happens to people doesn't correlate to their moral status. It could mean everything is horrible. Everything is actively horrible. And I have not really read enough to kind of be able to say, oh yeah, this is a perfect example of this, this, and this, and this. And the obvious one I haven't read are Scott Bakker, Prince of Nothing, and other books by him, which are very grim, apparently very philosophically grim. It can't just be bad things happen to good characters, or that even that you get a lot of detail of nasty stuff. A good example of that might be Robin Hobb. Hobb tortures her characters famously. For me, I'm sort of somewhat inoculated against the extremes of that, where people get bothered by it because you just read your Dickens and 19th century melodrama and you've read it before. But it's not, you know, it's not grimdark. There's a moral universe. Your main characters are on arcs towards some sort of success. They grow, they develop, they succeed. So maybe that's the thing. As we can tell, that's not grimdark, even if it is at points grim. It has to be about ends. It has to be about the results. And so, I mean, let's just kind of have a look at... another series I hear is pretty dark, or another writer I hear is pretty dark, is J.V. Jones. I own Baker's Boy. I have not read it. But it does say it's a wondrous epic of darkness and beauty. And apparently, yeah, J.P. Jones she's a pretty grim writer. So I place her on the spectrum in the comments maybe. But of the books I know that people call grimdark or something close to it, this is the least often called it. Gentlemen Bastards, Lies of Locke and Mora. I mean, I think this is pretty obviously not. Some bad things happen to some characters we kind of like or kind of know. Our heroes succeed. And it is, I think it is a grimy, gritty world. Mock Venice, what's it called? Again, K-More, is grimy and gritty, and people are corrupt, and there's lots of very explicit violence, very gruesome violence. So maybe that's grimdark. In which case, I think we could possibly draw Tarantino usefully into that. Maybe Tarantino's grimdark. Except Tarantino, if we're talking about the moral dimension, Tarantino's movies, though they are perhaps at points morally objectionable, are in a moral universe, and you have characters you're sort of rooting for. And it's similar here, that we back the people who are fundamentally the good guys. They steal a bit, but they're nowhere near as bad as the bad guys. And so we look forward to seeing them succeed, and they significantly succeed, if not wholly. And I mean, there's some nuance there. Maybe one of those things is that grimdark we would associate, maybe not with complete catastrophe, but with nuance in results. I don't know. I would say The Lies of Locke and Mora is not grimdark if we're using that kind of moral emptiness and horrible endings kind of side of it. What about Song of Ice and Fire? Again, I think what you could say is that there are good characters we like, that is to say, who end badly in some way or another. The most obvious famous ones would be Ned Stark, Robb Stark, Catelyn Stark, and some in a second tier, people like Oberyn Martell or Kevin Lannister. Actually, he's a good guy. It's only because the conspirators want continued chaos, blah blah blah. So there's a bunch of, and one thing, of course, there's not a finished series, and is unlikely to be anytime soon anyway. But so we don't know the final endings of characters, but we have habits that Martin has, which is that there are noble consequences to actions, and those actions are the actions are explicitly telegraphed, the likely results are telegraphed. And I think, though I haven't watched really very much the TV series at all, I think it's interesting that the post-book endings, the post-completed book ending, stuck onto that series, ends up with what's probably not Martin's ending for what he might say would be the book's ending, but something which was part he worked on. Ends up with Bran, the cripple from the beginning, who's gone the whole way through on the mystical journey, becoming basically president of a republic. And the idea that what we are likely to see is, though there'll be tragedy and characters we like dying due to necessity, sacrifice, or due to the noble consequences of actions. In that sense, I think Ned, I think I said this in the video on whether or not it was full of twists. Ned dying is a good definition of how the series works, in terms of when you're told again and again that there is a likely consequence to something, it will happen. There won't be a last minute escape from it generally. Of course, there is for Arya in exactly the same in that situation, but it's a tortuous journey thereafter. So there are noble consequences to actions. So yeah, bad things happen to characters we like. Those are fatal things. They are sad things. They lead to frustrating things. We hear about the harrowing of the North or whatever. But it's important to say that there's still protagonists who, aside from Ned, our protagonists continue and develop and gain skills and gain influence. And though, of course, there will be some sort of great showdown and a bunch of deaths in the putative ending, it doesn't seem to me as if we're talking, all the main characters are going to have horrible endings. Nor is the world of A Song of Ice and Fire an immoral world, or, well, maybe, actually, sorry, it is not an amoral world. You might object that it might be an immoral world. But if well, when we look at the narrative thrust of it and the way in which sympathetic protagonists struggle against suffering, go through trial, advance and succeed and triumph over some of their obstacles, even if there are costs along the way, when we look at that, we are looking at a narrative universe which rewards some kind of virtue, and not making profoundly stupid decisions as well. Read Rob Stark. So I think it'd be wrong to say, okay, well, maybe the heroes get away with it, but it's still a very amoral and grey universe, because in the end, whose side are you on? You're like, yeah, I mean, sure, if amorality simply means that you can understand different perspectives, I mean, that's a terrifying definition of amorality, the idea that, in fact, it's a contradictory one, because the fact you can understand different perspectives is precisely because you recognise some sort of moral purpose and core to people, even if it's in part contradictory. So I think I look at Song of Ice and Fire, and I think in the grim darkness of the future there is only war. It can be pretty grim and harrowing, I agree, but the universe and the general arcs, the narrative, don't point towards endless misery. And you think of the fact that the last book will be called A Dream of Spring. Everything comes round, things get better. There are times of prosperity and happiness. Abercrombie, a diversion. Abercrombie, obviously, he has, I think, reviewed David Gemmell on. I think he's one of the kind of famous authors who's reviewed David Gemmell, and I think he's won some Gemmell Awards when that was still running. And he's seen as a successor to Gemmell, as he's a British fantasy author who writes what seems at first glance, and it's not really, but to be action fantasy. He's actually very different from reading any. He's not at all Gemmell-esque really in terms of a lot of the structure and style. But there are some similarities. And one thing that struck me was David Gemmell. I might be able to make a useful illustration out of it here. David Gemmell once said that he really liked people like Louis L'Amour and other Western pulp writers. And he felt that without his religious beliefs, he would have ended up writing, not necessarily like L'Amour, but like some of the Western pulp writers, quite grey and amoral fiction with characters who were fundamentally bad as your protagonists. And I mean, I would say this is not the point. I don't think A Game of Thrones presents protagonists who are fundamentally bad, nor does Liza Lachlan Mora. I think, nor does The First Law, but I think you can see maybe there's something there that where, for Gemmell, he ends up looking at characters who often struggle with great sin, if you want to call it that, great mistakes in their life, need for redemption. Though he has those characters, and that's common, the idea is that there is redemption, there is a moral kind of function within the universe and within the world. And I think you look at Abercrombie, and though his characters are not simply evil by any means, his protagonists have a great deal of sympathy to them, and good characteristics about them. And I've only read the First Law trilogy of his, so I can't comment on the other books. But I think there are a few things which come closer to that, not wholly all the way there, but to that absolute maximal 40k grimdarkness. And what I mean is this, to a couple of examples. One is that the characters, they're flawed and traumatized and sympathetic, and you think, oh, I really want to see them succeed. And you kind of see them succeed in some ways, but it's very often made very clear that their successes are illusory or tragic. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that a big thing is that Abercrombie sets up characters to ultimately fundamentally fail, even if technically they've succeeded. And that's kind of and it's an interesting and different way of approaching things, because what the fruits of action in narrative point toward the moral construct of the author. Basically, let's put it that way. The fruits of action and what you see happening to characters tells you something about what the author thinks about the way the world works, and that because no one has an idea of causality that's completely distinct and separate from their idea of morality. no one actually thinks, well, you know, there's such a thing as morality, but nothing that happens has nothing to do with that, or at least we don't think it narratively. It may feel like that in practice when we see bad things happen to good people, but what narratively, we tell stories about that. We say, okay, this was a crime. If we're talking about that thing that happened with that person was a crime, then we assume there is some sort of court that could judge it almost. Or that thing that happened to me that was bad, that's helped me become stronger. We see it as part of a personal journey. For Abercrombie, you have characters. You have, for instance, in Glockter and Jezzel, are the obvious ones in the First Law trilogy. You have characters, particularly in Jezzel, but you know also in Glockter, who you see go from being very unsympathetic theoretically to being really quite sympathetic in some ways, to growing in some ways seemingly. And then there's questions. I mean, does Jezzel grow? You know, I think he does, but you know, you're almost brought to ask, does he grow, or how far does he grow? And of course, he then has, you know, the knowledge that he is really just there at Byers' discretion, and he has no real power to affect stuff. He can maybe make a few small changes that help a few people. You know, and that's certainly a statement. That is a big thing that Abercrombie is saying about the nature of power, is that it's often illusory. Glockter kind of comes in some ways the most through everything, and you see the most growth in that. And I mean that he's a popular character partly because of that. Logan, of course, you see not quite the opposite, but this sense in which he starts and ends at the same place, you know, pretty much literally, and you discover that there's whether it's a supernatural thing or a psychotic thing, he's an exceptionally dangerous, broken man, despite the good that he does and despite the wisdom and decency and kindness he shows at different points. So yeah, and obviously your secondary characters, or secondary primaries, or whatever you want to say. Similarly, I mean, West obviously ends very unpleasantly and tragically, and he's nearly the most sympathetic character in the whole thing, pretty much. So yeah, there is something more of that sense that action is futile, doing good doesn't go anywhere, personal growth is stymied. The one thing that just niggles slightly, the one thing that just breaks the grim darkness, that perhaps suggests that Joe Abercrombie is not quite the Lord Grimdark we all say he is that ultimately there is a concept of what people should or shouldn't do. It is not the case that really Glockter torturing people because he's been traumatized is completely normal. It's presented as normal. It's presented as bad. That Jezzel is vain is bad, that he grows is good, that growth may be stymied, or that ultimately leads to the kind of futile end of he's not able to help people. That's bad. And there's some chance that some growth sometimes matters or works or has purpose, and that's what you'd say about Glockter, I guess. So I don't know. I think you could say that possibly the whole concept of the typical idea of the grimdark, which comes out of, I mean, it actually doesn't even come originally. You'd actually look at 2000 AD comics, you know, some of your Judge Dredd and your Pat Mills Nemesis, things like that, and say that's the real origins of grimdark. Though I mean, Nemesis is more sort of upbeat than that, but these very Baroque and Gothic inspired aesthetics with lots of weird stuff going on, and even that all that depends on an intuitive morality. Maybe all grimdark actually of that brand ultimately cannot be grimdark because it really does believe in a moral universe, just one where the fruit of action doesn't seem to line up with the real moral laws of the universe. There's a contradiction between the two. And maybe truly, truly grimdark things are those things which go beyond that, the things I'm not familiar with. People seem to think that's what Prince of Nothing and other Backer books are, that are genuinely nihilistic, that cannot tell it, that internally cannot tell a distinction between a good action and a bad action. I don't know. As I've said a few times, I'd love to hear more theories on that in the comments and recommendations, if you like. One reason I'm not a massive grimdark reader is because if I want to find things gloomy, I can turn the news on. But I'm always up for good stories, and particularly ones that maybe sort of do something subtler with the idea of a dark universe and the way in which humans deal with that. Anyway, you tell me in the comments, and I will see you next time.